Welcome to this podcast on the topic of economic indicators. Economic indicators is actually an incredibly important topic. The information covered here will help you to understand how well the economy is doing. It will also help you to better understand things you read, see, and hear discussed in the media, as the terms GDP, inflation, and unemployment are regularly used in any discussion of the state of the economy. These indicators are so often discussed because they are statistics that measure a country's economic health. They shine a light on what is happening economically within the nation. More specifically, indicators help economists to gain a lot of data, aka information, that they can analyze in order to see if the economy is healthy and doing well, how it's changing in response to what is happening in society, and the actions the government makes and how our economy is doing compared to other countries. Analyzing this data can help economists to predict how the economy will be in the future. This enables them to advise the President, Congress, and the Federal Reserve Bank, which we will learn about in another podcast, on what actions they should take to make or keep the economy going strong. The main economic indicators are the gross domestic product, which is known as the GDP, the inflation rate, and the unemployment rate. These indicators are the most important to studying the economy's health and will be discussed in depth. While these three are the most important, there are many other indicators that help economists to better understand the state of the economy. Three other indicators are the Consumer Confidence Index, the poverty rate, and new housing starts. These will be briefly discussed in a different podcast. Let's begin with the main indicators, which will be presented in this order: GDP, inflation, and unemployment. First up is GDP. The GDP is the number one economic indicator used to measure economic health because it is the standard measure that enables us to see how an economy grows over time. This is because the GDP itself measures the value of every final product produced in a country during a period of time. Usually this period of time is defined as 1 year. Economic growth is important because it leads to increasing wealth. Regarding GDP, it is important to note that it is the finished product, meaning that the product must be completed in that country, that will count in the country's GDP. GDPs vary significantly by country. Overall, the U.S. has the largest GDP of any nation, and Tuvalu the smallest. The graphic on the slide is a visual representation of the size of different nations and regions' GDPs. China and Japan have very large GDPs, as does the group of countries in Europe that use the euro as their currency. It is important to remember, though, that the GDP is not measuring whether or not people are rich in a country, just how much the country produces. There are two types of GDP: the nominal GDP, which is not adjusted for inflation, and the real GDP, which is. I will discuss inflation more in depth later in this podcast, but what's important to know here is that the value of money changes over time. What might have cost someone 1 cent 100 years ago may cost somebody $1 today. Therefore, when you don't adjust for inflation, it's very difficult to compare how much an economy produced from year to year. As a result, it is more important to look at the real GDP when comparing how a country's economy grew over time. Here is a graph showing the real GDP in blue versus the nominal GDP in red. Both show that the economy has grown over time, but the real GDP is the better line to look at. For example, if we look at growth since 2009, it would look like our economy was growing faster than it actually did if we only looked at the nominal GDP. The real GDP line shows a much more steady growth and is a more accurate measure. The dollar value of goods and services produced from one point in time to another is used to calculate the GDP growth rate. That is the percentage change, positive or negative, that the economy grew or shrunk in that period of time. The graph on this slide shows the percentage the economy grew or shrank each quarter, or 3 months, from 2001 to 2013. We know we had a recession in 2008-2009 because the economy shrank for at least 2 consecutive quarters, which is the definition of a recession. Another important aspect of measuring the GDP is calculating the GDP per capita. Per capita literally means per head in Latin. The GDP per capita is a country's GDP divided by its population. This means we can see the average amount each person is producing over a certain period of time. It gives us a better idea of how wealthy an economy is, given that some countries with smaller populations have smaller but excellent economies. This is a super important aspect of the GDP as an indicator because the population varies a lot between nations. The graph on the right is an example that shows the GDP per capita over time for a few countries up until 2008. Notice the United States had a pretty high per capita GDP. It still does. However, the US does not have the highest GDP per capita. Again, this is because it may have the largest economy in the world, but it also has the world's third largest population after China and India. Therefore, to get the per capita GDP, the GDP has to be divided over a population of more than 300 million people. When we do that, the United States actually ranks about 9th out of all nations, still pretty high. Luxembourg is actually ranked number 1. This is because per person, and there aren't a lot of people in Luxembourg, only about 600,000, Luxembourg actually produces quite a lot. Some countries don't produce nearly as much per capita as others. This map demonstrates how GDP per capita can be used as a measure of a nation's wealth, as the data shows lower per capita GDPs in regions that have high rates of poverty and vice versa. Although this is true, one of the drawbacks of GDP and GDP per capita is that wealth is not always evenly distributed. Some countries might have high GDPs per capita, but still have a lot of poor people. This is why GDP is only one indicator of a country's wealth. To summarize this first indicator, GDP is the value of what is produced in a country over a given period of time. In the United States, the ideal GDP growth rate is 2 to 3% per year. While GDP is the top indicator for how a country is doing financially, it is limited because even when measured per capita, it fails to look at individual wealth. Now I will discuss the second main economic indicator, inflation. Inflation is defined as an increase in prices and the fall in purchasing power of money. As inflation occurs, goods and services become more expensive. Inflation isn't a bad thing, however. One part of the definition of inflation has to do with purchasing power. Purchasing power means the ability of people to buy a certain amount of goods or services. So another way to explain inflation is that as prices rise, the amount people can afford to buy with that same amount of money falls. This means, as shown by the chart, that as inflation has occurred over time, the amount of things a person could buy with a single dollar has decreased. For example, in 1920, a dollar could buy you at least 10 hot dogs. Today, a dollar might buy you a quarter of a hot dog. That means people's purchasing power must have gone down. Economists use the percentage at which a certain currency, money from a country, loses value over a period of time in order to see how quickly price level is changing. One thing I already noted is that inflation is not a bad thing. In fact, a small amount of it, ideally 1 to 2% a year, is considered a good thing. Some inflation is needed to help economic growth because it leads to an increase in GDP. However, too much inflation too quickly is a very bad thing. It can cause prices to increase more quickly than people's wages, which means that many of them would have trouble affording all the goods and services they need and want. The way inflation is measured is through something called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. The CPI is able to measure the changing price level because it is calculated by finding the average cost of a market basket of goods at a certain period of time and then comparing it to another point in time to see how much prices had changed since then. In order to get the CPI, the same goods are bought every few months so that price changes can be tracked. The typical market basket includes the typical things that people spend money on. This includes housing, which people tend to spend a lot of money on, as well as transportation, food, medical care, entertainment, etc. It is important that this typical market basket include a lot of things in many categories because prices for various goods and services don't increase or decrease at the same rate over time. Even if some things are getting more expensive, other things may be getting cheaper. The CPI is an average of all these things. Take a look at this graph. This demonstrates which goods and services prices rose more than inflation and are thus more expensive for people to buy, as well as the products that have not risen in price as fast as inflation. In general, household items and technology have become more affordable based on the amount of money people have. However, the things that rose in price the most, hospital and medical care, and also college tuition, outpaced inflation by a lot, and those things are really expensive to begin with. When all those products are bundled together as one and calculated, we can look at where the CPI should be in terms of price increases versus where it was. We've not had the intense inflation shown on this graph since the 1970s, but some years are better than others. Zooming out and looking at the United States from 1870 until 2012, it is easy to point out something called deflation. Deflation is the opposite of inflation. As mentioned already, a small amount of inflation is a good thing, though too much inflation means the economy is actually moving too fast. Just as inflation makes things more expensive, deflation makes things cheaper. This is because the value of the dollar decreases. However, that is not a good thing because deflation means that the economy is most likely contracting, meaning the GDP is also decreasing, which would lead to higher rates of unemployment. Therefore, while at first one would think it would be nice to have all the prices decrease, it's actually not, since wages are most likely shrinking, as are the amount of available jobs. In summary, calculating inflation allows people to see how much prices increase and purchasing power decreases over time. While some inflation, an inflation rate of 1 to 2% a year, is good in order to help the economy grow, any inflation above that amount makes it difficult for people to buy things. I will now explain unemployment, the third of the major economic indicators. The unemployment rate measures the percent of people not currently working who have been actively looking for a job in the past 4 weeks. The unemployment rate is an important indicator of the health of the economy because the economy cannot do well if people are not working. However, having some unemployment is a good thing because there will always be people between jobs, and it means there are enough applicants to apply for jobs so that employers can choose someone who will be a good fit in that position. Therefore, the ideal unemployment rate should be between about 4 and 6%. In recent years, it's been a little lower than that, which has been good in that wages rose, but it also meant that some positions remained unfilled. With that being said, having at least 94% of people who are willing and able to currently work actually working is very important. It relates back to how the economy flows. A growing economy needs people to spend money, so businesses have money to hire people and make products. Those people who are working bring home money in the form of income, which they spend so businesses can do even more. When people aren't making an income, they are not spending money and the economy will slow down and cannot grow. In fact, if too many people are unemployed, the economy will shrink. This growth, as we know from earlier in the podcast, is measured by the GDP. Unemployment is therefore correlated or related to GDP growth or decreases. In fact, this graph using the years 1960 to 2016, shows the correlation between GDP and unemployment. Those blue shaded areas are periods of economic recession, a shrinking GDP. When the GDP has shrunk, high unemployment followed. This is not a good thing because it not only makes it hard for the economy to start growing again, but it also puts a burden on the social safety nets such as unemployment benefits and food stamps. It also indicates that even when the economy starts growing again, if many people are still out of work, there are a lot of people who still need government help. Before continuing, it's important to point out that to be considered unemployed, you can't be below 16 or above 65, nor can you have worked at all in the past 4 weeks. You also can't be a member of the military. Finally, you have to have been looking for a job in the past 4 weeks and not have been able to find one. If you are not employed because you are not looking for work, then you aren't even counted in the labor force because you're not seen as able to work. People enter and exit the labor force all the time. For example, a stay-at-home mom may return to work once her kids enter school. When we calculate the unemployment rate, we look at the amount of people unemployed and divide it by the amount of people in the labor force. Those numbers are always changing. Not only are the number of people in the labor force and who are unemployed changing, but the number of jobs in the economy is constantly changing as well. A lot of jobs were lost during the Great Recession, as you can see on this graph, but new jobs have been created pretty consistently since then, which is correlated with a falling unemployment rate. Overall, the U.S. unemployment rate has been quite low compared to other nations, and as of 2019, the national unemployment rate stayed under 4%. Again, this is below the ideal, meaning some businesses had trouble filling certain positions. It was good in that most Americans who wanted jobs had them, however. Unemployment numbers also vary by state since the country is so huge and different states have different economic needs. This map contains data from August 2019. Besides varying by state, unemployment numbers can also vary by season. For example, stores hire more workers during the holidays and vacation destinations hire more workers for only a season at a time. Those workers then have to look for other work in the off-season, changing the unemployment rate in that area. The map on the last slide showed historically low unemployment rates. However, unemployment rates that are so low can be misleading. This is because there are some issues with the way the unemployment rate is calculated. First, some people give up looking when they can't find a job. They are known as discouraged workers. Once they give up, they are no longer in the labor force and thus don't count at all. The bigger problem is the underemployed worker. In a weaker economy, it may mean that millions of people are not considered unemployed because they are working part-time even though they really want a full-time job. In a stronger economy, this is most likely someone who is overqualified for a job. For example, this would be a person with a college degree flipping burgers at McDonald's. While the federal government doesn't calculate underemployed workers, it is nonetheless an issue. As new jobs are created by a growing economy, it doesn't help people as much if the new ones being created are ones that pay very little and require fewer skills. This is because lower paying jobs don't always pay enough for families to survive. Underemployment is also something to think about when deciding what type of post-high school education to pursue. A lot of college graduates in some liberal arts majors don't necessarily have the skills that match the higher skilled jobs and end up becoming underemployed while also trying to pay off college loans. To summarize this indicator, unemployment rates allow economists to see how many people in an economy are looking for work. While a flawed statistic due to underemployment, these rates can help us to see how well the public is doing economically and the impact the GDP is having on people. While the unemployment rate should ideally be between 4 and 6%, in recent years, it has sometimes been just a little bit under the ideal, but that's okay. You have just viewed a podcast on the 3 most important economic indicators. Hopefully, you have a broader understanding of what they are and why they are important. Thanks for listening.